As we've seen as we've been looking at Revelation, according to the book of Revelation, humanity consists of two and only two types or groups of people. Those who worship the beast, those who worship the Lamb, those who dwell on the earth, those who are citizens of heaven, those who are citizens of the great city, Babylon, and those who are citizens of the beloved city, the New Jerusalem. We've seen reference to Babylon the Great earlier at the end of history. For example, in chapter 14, verse 8, it says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality." And then it goes on to describe the judgment. Then at the end of chapter 16, when it was talking about the seventh bowl, namely the end of history and the second coming, in verse 19 of chapter 16 it said, "The great city was split into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath." But nowhere else had Babylon the Great been specifically talked about in detail. Now, beginning in this next section, which begins in chapter 17, going through chapter 19, Babylon the Great is talked about in great detail, particularly in chapters 17 and 18. And again, this is consistent with the structure of the book, which has overlapping sections. All of the sections, they basically talk about the world and the church from the first century all the way up until the second coming of Christ, and the sections end with the second coming and the judgment. Then the next section picks up at the beginning again, using different imagery. But remember that we mentioned that the sections, this is called progressive parallelism, that the later sections, as we go through the book, the later sections tend to add more details than what was announced in the beginning is then fleshed out in later sections. And furthermore, greater detail is spent on the things of the end in connection with the second coming. We'll see that particularly when we get to Revelation chapter 19, because verses 11 through the end of the chapter 19 through 21 focus specifically on the events of the second coming. So here, John is doing the same kind of thing as he has done throughout the book. He's going back and now filling in a lot of details about what Babylon the Great is like. And so he begins in chapter 17, verse 1. "One of the angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, 'Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality.'" Take note. Again, he's using that phrase, "those who dwell on the earth." Again, showing that this harlot, and we're going to see the harlot is one image of Babylon. This is a worldwide entity. Verse 3 goes on to say, "And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hands a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth." And it goes on later on then to say that the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. It talks about also the fact that in verse 9, chapter 17, verse 9, Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And in verse 15, it goes on to say, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So again, this is symbolic language, and chapter 17 concludes by saying, the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So let's discuss some important aspects of this. First, take a look at, in its first century context, many commentators identify Babylon with Rome. And one important reason for that is, as verse 9 says, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And of course, Rome is called the city of the 7 hills. However, the Bible uses the phrase mountains, or actually the Greek, which the NIV translates it as the 7 hills. The word is oros, which means a relatively high elevation, higher than a bunos, which is a minor elevation or hill. Now, that is why many translations say sits on 7 mountains, and is a reason why, while there is I think John again was drawing on imagery from his own day and culture. Rome is known as the city of 7 hills, but the hills upon which Rome is set are relatively minor elevation. Here it's talking about 7 mountains, which suggests that Babylon transcends and is far greater than just ancient Rome. So also, yes, he's drawing from his own culture, from Roman culture. But what he's saying, but notice how the woman is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth, and she's called Babylon, the mother of harlots, suggesting that what's going on here, Rome in the first century and any anti-Christian culture and society anywhere in the world, is depicted as a corrupting influence on people, namely a harlot. And you see, notice how it says she's dressed, clothed with purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a gold cup full of abominations of her immorality. A harlot, and that imagery of wealth and gold and purple and so on and so forth, shows how she is alluring. And of course, that is the one thing that wealth and the many good things of this world can do. They can turn our heads, and we don't even realize that our heads have been turned. Now, we've also said that the source of John's imagery is not only his own culture and time, but also the Old Testament. And the 2 primary sources for John's depiction of Babylon are Jeremiah's oracle against historical Babylon in Jeremiah 50 and 51, and Ezekiel's oracle against Tyre, which is found in Ezekiel 26 through 28. Again, both of those oracles, they're talking first about cultural and economic exploitation, and secondly, about religious corruption. And that's what's going on. That's what happened in Babylon, that's what happened in Tyre, and that's what's happening in Mystery Babylon here in Revelation. And these things are related. Economic and cultural exploitation and religious corruption are related because Jesus frequently warned the fact that riches can allure and lure us away and can choke the word off in our lives. So we need to be aware of this. Now, the images of the harlot drawn from the Old Testament oracles concerning Tyre primarily relate to cultural and economic exploitation. Tyre was known for its commercial enterprises, and of course, Rome in John's day, had an empire which offered certain economic benefits and offered the Mediterranean world unity, security, and stability, and a certain prosperity. But what John is saying is these benefits are not what they seem. They are the favors of a prostitute purchased at a high price, which, if you follow her, will cost you your life. Now, there's a couple of other interesting aspects of this, again, which shows what John is doing, drawing on things from his culture, but then universalizing them. For example, in chapter 18, in verses 12 and 13, it talks about the cargoes that the buying and selling, and it talks about the cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and linen and all kinds of things. And it ends with the cargoes of horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. Now, Richard Bauckham, a British Christian scholar, has compared Ezekiel's account of Tyre's trade in Ezekiel 27 with John's account of Rome's trade, and concludes that Ezekiel's account was an accurate portrayal of Tyre's trade in the 6th century BC, and John's list of cargoes is an accurate list of Rome's imports in the 1st century AD. So again, John is drawing from things of his own time and place, but he's making a theological point, and specifically the point regarding slavery. Slavery was the basis of Rome's economic system, and John mentions that at the end of his list as part of Babylon the Great's cargoes, and he does this in a profoundly theological way, because he says that he talks about slaves and human lives. In other words, what he's saying is that this indicates that human brutality, the contempt for human life, upon which all of Rome's prosperity and luxury were based, at root is immoral. Because he's saying that by using the common term for slaves and then the scriptural depiction of slaves, human lives, or more literally, the souls of people, he's intending this as a comment on the slave trade, and more generally, a comment on how we treat people. And this is profoundly important because, as you know, even back in the beginning, in Genesis, human beings are said to be made in the image of God. And therefore, how we treat people at root shows what we really think of God. If we treat people just as things, as slaves, as bodies to be owned and exploited, that's really a comment on what we think of God, because we are treating the image of God that way. And so, you see, I've said in other contexts in these lectures, John is making a number of points, but his most important points are theological. And so we're looking at this in chapter 18. It talks about those who mourn for Babylon. And so it says, it talks about the kings of the earth, the merchants of the earth, every shipmaster, passenger, sailor, and all those who make their living by the sea. And so, in other words, these are precisely the people who benefited from Rome's economic exploitation. And so what they are lamenting when Babylon is destroyed is they're lamenting the destruction of their own source of wealth. And so, once again, what John is doing, I mean, we all live in physical bodies in a physical world. We all need money. We all want money. Money is a good thing. We all wish we had more than we had. And yet, money is profoundly theological. It can turn our heads and turn our affections away from primarily loving and worshiping and honoring the Lord with our lives. Now, so we've seen in a number of ways how Babylon the Great is based in first century Rome and the culture of Rome. It's also drawn from Old Testament oracles against Babylon and Tyre. But Babylon the Great is not limited to Rome. It is universal. And again, this is the point I want to stress again, because don't think of Babylon just as a city in the world. It is the city of the world. And we know that from the universal language that John uses. Now, Babylon, of course, is described as the mother of harlots. And in verse 5, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And furthermore, in chapter 17, verse 15, he said, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. That corresponds to the way the church is described in Revelation 5, verse 9, where God has his people out of every tribe and tongue and nation and people of the entire world. So just as the church is universal, so is Babylon the Great. She sits, the waters she sits on are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So people of all languages, of all countries, of every tribe. That means Babylon the Great is universal. Furthermore, in chapter 17, verse 18, it says, the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Babylon in ancient Iraq did not reign over the kings of the earth. This Babylon is the universal Babylon, and it does. Furthermore, in chapter 18, in verse 3, it says, all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. 18 verse 9, the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning. And verse 11, and the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. And in verses 23 and 24 of chapter 18, it says, the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on the earth. That is universal language, which shows that Babylon the Great is John's depiction of the great universal anti-Christian society, government, culture. And it will manifest itself differently in different times and places. It's not limited to one country at all. And so, just as John combined in Revelation Daniel's 4 beasts into one, so Babylon combines all of the great evils of those 2 historic evil cities, Babylon and Tyre. And so what he's doing is he's confronting his audience with the choice between the beast or the lamb, the world or the church, the great city or the beloved city, because Babylon is the anti-kingdom. It's the alluring, all-encompassing alternative to the kingdom of God. Now, in Revelation 18, verse 8, it talks about the destruction that will come. And notice, Babylon the Great is great. It's the whole world, basically. But it says that your destruction will come in an hour. So it will come suddenly, just as Jesus is coming at a time we do not expect. He will come suddenly, he will come unexpectedly, and then this world will be over. But in verse 8 of chapter 18, it says, in one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire for the Lord God who judges her as strong. Now, the reference to the fire makes us think of Sodom and Gomorrah. And also, again, but this is profoundly theological, remember, because in the Old Testament, according to the law of Moses, burning appears to have been the punishment of fornication only in the case of a priest's daughter. And so we talked about the fact that Babylon the Great involves both economic and cultural exploitation, but also religious corruption. And so the conclusion here is that Babylon is a spiritual city. But remember that throughout the Bible, following after other gods is equated with spiritual adultery. So the Bible uses sexual imagery to talk about economic exploitation as well. So there are this connection between economics and the spiritual side of life is reinforced in the fact that when in chapter 18, verse 3, it says, the merchants have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. The sensuality conveys the idea of the Greek word used, means profligate luxury, such as men abandon themselves to when they have shaken off the reins of religion and reason. So you see how economic exploitation is connected with spiritual corruption. And that is why, of course, God brings judgment, because people have shaken off the reins of religion and reason. And so and it's very interesting that in ancient, I mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah, which is also suggested by God's bringing fire on Babylon. You remember, though, why did God do that to Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, Ezekiel tells us, and again, it shows the connection between economic exploitation and spiritual corruption. Because in Ezekiel chapter 16, God says this, and in verses 49 and 50, he says, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and the needy. Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it." Most people think of Sodom and Gomorrah in purely sexual terms. That's not what God says the main problem was. It was they had abundance, they had ease, and they did not take care of the poor and the needy. And that's the same picture that is being painted here of the great world civilization of Babylon the Great. She is a harlot, she is in luxury, she allures the kings and merchants and people of the earth, and God is going to remove her with fire the same way he brought on ancient Sodom. Now, a few other things before we conclude this lecture that I want to draw your attention to. Babylon the harlot is compared with the pure woman of chapter 12, verse 1. Remember, we talked about the pure woman in chapter 12, verse 1 really represents the ideal Zion, God's Old Testament and New Testament people. And so I have tables in your book that compare this. The woman in Revelation 12, clothed with the sun. The great harlot is clothed with purple and scarlet. The woman in chapter 12 gave birth to a son. The great harlot is the mother of harlots. The woman in chapter 12 fled into the wilderness. The great harlot lives sensuously with the kings and merchants of the earth. The woman in chapter 12 was sustained by God. The great harlot is carried by the beast. The woman in chapter 12 is persecuted by the dragon. The great harlot is drunk with the blood of the saints. So we see a great contrast here. And one of the things he's pointing out is, don't consider your suffering to be a sign necessarily that you're in sin or being punished. This is the way of the world. If you're living for the world, I mean, it's getting us to try and evaluate what is most important to us. Likewise, Babylon the Great is the counterpart to the New Jerusalem. And so, for example, the New Jerusalem, we'll get to in a later lecture, is talked about specifically in Revelation 21 and 22. But Babylon here in chapter 17 and 18, I have a table that shows that the introduction to both Babylon and New Jerusalem are virtually identical. In each case, John is approached by an angel. There's an invitation. Come, I will show you. They're taken either to the wilderness in 17 verse 3 or to a high mountain in 21 verse 10. Then the vision opens. But Babylon, of course, is dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet. New Jerusalem is dressed in fine linen, bright and clean. Babylon is said to be adorned with gold. The New Jerusalem is made of pure gold. Babylon is adorned with jewels. The foundation stones of New Jerusalem have every kind of precious stones. And Babylon is said to be adorned with pearls. The 12 gates of New Jerusalem are 12 pearls. Yet, there are great contrasts. Babylon is the great harlot. New Jerusalem is the bride, the wife of the Lamb. According to chapter 18, verse 2, Babylon is the dwelling place of demons, but New Jerusalem is the dwelling place of God. In Babylon, a name is written on her forehead in chapter 17, verse 5, the name being Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. New Jerusalem, God's name is written on its citizens' foreheads. According to Revelation 17, verse 8, Babylon's followers are not in the book of life, but Revelation 21:27, its citizens of New Jerusalem are in the Lamb's book of life. According to Revelation 18, verse 2, Babylon is a prison of unclean spirits and unclean birds, full of abominations and immorality. But in New Jerusalem, nothing unclean will enter it. According to Revelation 17 and 18, her wine makes the nations drunk, but in New Jerusalem, the water of life is given freely. And God's people are called to come out of Babylon. God's people are called to enter New Jerusalem. Babylon is doomed to destruction, but the saints in New Jerusalem will reign forever and ever. So these are tremendous contrasts. And finally, before we close this lecture, we've said that John takes things from the Old Testament and history and then universalizes them. And the judgment on Babylon the Great is modeled on the judgment of historical Babylon, because in Revelation 18, it says that in verse 7, John quotes from Isaiah 47, where it says, I sit as a queen and am not a widow. That's what Babylon the harlot is saying. That's a quotation from Isaiah 47, verses 7 and 8, concerning Babylon, historical Babylon's sensuality. But the comparison, actually, Isaiah 47 is kind of a template for the destruction of Babylon the Great as revealed in Revelation 18. In both cases, she called herself a queen, not a widow. She thinks she's secure. In both cases, historical Babylon and Babylon the Great glorifies herself, is sensual, uses sorcery, and is sinful. And in both cases, judgment came quickly, she will burn, and those who slept with her cannot save her. So he is using historical examples to tell us that the end is sure. And I should finally point out, God's judgments are true and righteous altogether. Because in the judgment on Babylon, in Revelation 18:4 and 5, it says, her sins and her iniquities have come up before God, and she will be paid back, according to chapter 18, verse 6, according to her deeds. And then in chapter 19, verse 2, it says that God's judgments are true and righteous. And so the repeated references to her immorality, her sins, her iniquities show us that what is being judged here is that which is evil. God's judgments are true and righteous. And therefore, even though we live physically in what the Bible is calling Babylon the Great, that doesn't mean we are sinful or iniquitous, okay? When bad things happen and when God sends judgments, we may suffer, but that does not mean we are being judged. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to focus on Revelation chapter 19, which concentrates on the second coming of Christ, and we will talk more about the judgment then.